I'm reading from William James's book, The Principles of Psychology, the section titled The Self. The me and the I. Whatever I may be thinking of, I am always at the same time more or less aware of myself, of my personal existence. At the same time, it is I who am aware, so that the total self of me, being as it were duplex, partly known and partly knower, partly object and partly subject, must have two aspects discriminated in it, of which for shortness we call one the me and the other the I. I call these discriminated aspects and not separate things because the identity of I with me, even in the very act of their discrimination, is perhaps the most ineradicable dictum of common sense, and must not be undermined by our terminology here at the outset, whatever we may come to think of its validity at our inquiry's end. I shall therefore treat successively of A, the self as known, or the me, the empirical ego as it is sometimes called, and of B, the self as knower, or the I, the pure ego of certain authors. A, the self as known, the me. The empirical self, or me. Between what a man calls me and what he simply calls mine, the line is difficult to draw. We feel and act about certain things that are ours very much as we feel and act about ourselves. Our fame, our children, the work of our hands may be as dear to us as our bodies are, and arouse the same feelings and the same sets of reprisal if attacked. And our bodies themselves, are they simply ours or are they us? Certainly men have been ready to disown their very bodies and to regard them as mere vestures, or even as prisons of clay from which they should someday be glad to escape. We see then that we are dealing with a fluctuating material, the same object being sometimes treated as part of me, as at other times as simply mine, and then again as if I had nothing to do with it at all. In its widest possible sense, however, a man's me is the sum total of all that he can call his, not only his body and his psychic powers, but his clothes and his house, his wife and children, his ancestors and friends, his reputation and works, his land and horses, and yacht and bank account. All these things give him the same emotions. If they wax and prosper, he feels triumphant. If they dwindle and die away, he feels cast down. Not necessarily in the same degree for each thing, but in much the same way for all. Understanding the me in this widest sense, we may begin by dividing the history of it into three parts, relating respectively to A, its constituents, B, the feelings and emotions they arouse, self-appreciation, C, the act to which they prompt, self-seeking and self-preservation. So A, the constituents of the me, may be divided into two classes, those which make up respectively the material me, the social me, and the spiritual me. The material me. The body is the innermost part of the material me in each of us, and certain parts of the body seem more intimately ours than the rest. The clothes come next. The old saying that the human person is composed of three parts, soul, body, and clothes, is more than a joke. We so appropriate our clothes and identify ourselves with them that there are few of us who, if asked to choose between having a beautiful body clad in raiment perpetually shabby and unclean, and having an ugly and blemished form always spotlessly attired, would not hesitate a moment before making a decisive reply. Next, our immediate family is part of ourselves. Our father and mother, our wife and babes, are bone of our bone and flesh of our flesh. When they die, a part of our very selves is gone. If they do anything wrong, it is our shame. If they are insulted, our anger flashes forth as readily as if we stood in their place. Our home comes next. Its scenes are part of our life. Its aspects awaken the tenderest feelings of affection, and we do not easily forgive the stranger who, in visiting it, finds fault with its arrangements or treats it with contempt. All these different things are the objects of instinctive preferences coupled with the most important practical interests of life. We all have a blind impulse to watch over our body, to deck it with clothing of an ornamental sort, to cherish parents, wife, and babes, and to find for ourselves a house of our own which we may live in and improve. An equally instinctive impulse drives us to collect property, and the collections thus made become, with different degrees of intimacy, parts of our empirical selves. The parts of our wealth most intimately ours are those which are saturated with our labor. There are few men who would not feel personally annihilated if a lifelong construction of their hands or brains, say an entomological collection or an extensive work in manuscript, were suddenly swept away. The miser feels similarly toward his gold, and although it is true that a part of our depression at the loss of possessions is due to our feeling that we must now go without certain goods that we expected the possessions to bring in their train, yet in every case there remains, over and above this, a sense of the shrinkage of our personality, a partial conversion of ourselves to nothingness, which is a psychological phenomenon by itself. We are all at once assimilated to the tramps and poor devils whom we so despise, and at the same time removed farther than ever, away from the happy sons of earth who lord it over land and sea and men in the full-blown lusthood that wealth and power can give, and before whom stiffen ourselves as we will by appealing to anti-snobbish first principles. We cannot escape an emotion, open or sneaking, of respect and dread. The social me. A man's social me is the recognition which he gets from his mates. We are not only gregarious animals, liking to be in sight of our fellows, but we have an innate propensity to get ourselves noticed, and noticed favorably by our kind. No more fiendish punishment could be devised, were such a thing physically possible, than that one should be turned loose in society and remain absolutely unnoticed by all the members thereof. If no one turned round when we entered, answered when we spoke, or minded what we did, but if every person we met cut us dead, and acted as if we were non-existent things, a kind of rage and impotent despair would ere long well up in us, from which the cruelest bodily tortures would be a relief. For these would make us feel that however bad might be our plight, we had not sunk to such a depth as to be unworthy of attention at all. Properly speaking, a man has as many social selves as there are individuals who recognize and carry an image of him in their mind. To wound any one of these his images is to wound him. But as the individuals who carry the images fall naturally into classes, we may practically say that he has as many different social selves as there are distinct groups of persons about whose opinion he cares. He generally shows a different side of himself to each of these different groups. Many a youth who is demure enough before his parents and teachers swears and swaggers like a pirate among his tough young friends. We do not show ourselves to our children as to our club companions, to our customers as to the laborers we employ, to our own masters and employers as to our intimate friends. From this there results what practically is a division of the man into several selves, and this may be a discordant splitting, as where one is afraid to let one set of his acquaintances know him as he is elsewhere, or it may be a perfectly harmonious division of labor, as where one tender to his children is stern to the soldiers or prisoners under his command. The most peculiar social self which one is apt to have is in the mind of the person one is in love with. The good or bad fortunes of this self cause the most intense elation and dejection, unreasonable enough as measured by every other standard than that of the organic feeling of the individual. To his own consciousness he is not, so long as this particular social self fails to get recognition, and when it is recognized, his contentment passes all bounds. A man's fame, good or bad, and his honor or dishonor are names for one of his social selves. The particular social self of a man called his honor is usually the result of one of those splittings of which we have spoken. It is his image in the eyes of his own set, which exalts or condemns him as he conforms or not to certain requirements that may not be made of one in another walk of life. Thus, a layman may abandon a city infected with cholera, but a priest or a doctor would not think such an act incompatible with his honor. Would think such an act incompatible with his honor. A soldier's honor requires him to fight or to die under circumstances where another man can apologize or run away with no stain upon his social self. A judge, a statesman, are in like manner debarred by the honor of their cloth from entering into pecuniary relations perfectly honorable to persons in private life. Nothing is commoner than to hear people discriminate between their different selves of this sort. As a man I pity you, but as an official I must show you no mercy. As a politician I regard him as an ally, but as a moralist I loathe him, etc., etc. What may be called club opinion is one of the very strongest forces in life. The thief must not steal from other thieves. The gambler must pay his gambling debts, though he pay no other debts in the world. The code of honor of fashionable society has throughout history been full of permissions as well as of vetoes. The only reason for following either of which is that so we best serve one of our social selves. You must not lie in general, but you may lie as much as you please if asked about your relations with a lady. You must accept a challenge from an equal, but if challenged by an inferior, you may laugh him to scorn. These are examples of what is meant. The spiritual me. By the spiritual me, so far as it belongs to the empirical self, I mean no one of my passing states of consciousness. I mean, rather, the entire collection of my states of consciousness, my psychic faculties and disposition taken concretely. This collection can, at any moment, become an object to my thought at that moment, and awaken emotions like those awakened by any of the other portions of the me. When we think of ourselves as thinkers, all the other ingredients of our me seem relatively external possessions. Even within the spiritual me, some ingredients seem more external than others. Our capacities for sensation, for example, are less intimate possessions, so to speak, than our emotions and desires. Our intellectual processes are less intimate than our volitional decisions. The more active feeling states of consciousness are thus the more central portions of the spiritual me. The very core and nucleus of ourself as we know it, the very sanctuary of our life, is the sense of activity which certain inner states possess. This sense of activity is often held to be a direct revelation of the living substance of our soul. Whether this be so or not is an ulterior question. I wish now only to lay down the peculiar internality of whatever states possess this quality of seeming to be active. It is as if they went out to meet all other elements of our experience. In thus feeling about them, probably all men agree. B. The feelings and emotions of self come after the constituents. Self-appreciation. This is of two sorts, self-complacency and self-dissatisfaction. Self-love more properly belongs under the division C of acts, since what men mean by that name is rather a set of motor tendencies than a kind of feeling properly so called. Language has synonyms enough for both kinds of self-appreciation. Thus, pride, conceit, vanity, self-esteem, arrogance, vainglory, and, on the other hand, modesty, humility, confusion, diffidence, shame, mortification, contrition, the sense of obloquy, and personal despair. These two opposite classes of affection seem to be direct and elementary endowments of our nature. Associationists would have it that they are, on the other hand, secondary phenomena arising from a rapid computation of the sensible pleasures or pains to which our prosperous or debased personal predicament is likely to lead, the sum of the represented pleasures forming the self-satisfaction, and the sum of the represented pains forming the opposite feeling of shame. No doubt, when we are self-satisfied, we do fondly rehearse all possible rewards for our desert, and when in a fit of self-despair we forebode evil. But the mere expectation of reward is not the self-satisfaction, and the mere apprehension of the evil is not the self-despair. For there is a certain average tone of self-feeling which each one of us carries about with him, and which is independent of the objective reasons we may have for satisfaction or discontent. That is, a very meanly conditioned man may abound in unfaltering conceit, and one whose success in life is secure, and who is esteemed by all, may remain diffident of his powers to the end. One may say, however, that the normal provocative of self-feeling is one's actual success or failure, and the good or bad actual position one holds in the world. He put in his thumb and pulled out a plum, and said, "What a good boy I am." A man with a broadly extended empirical ego, with powers that have uniformly brought him success, with place and wealth and friends and fame, is not likely to be visited by the morbid diffidences and doubts about himself which he had when he was a boy. Is not this great Babylon which I have planted? Whereas he who has made one blunder after another, and still lies in middle life among the failures at the foot of the hill, is liable to grow all sicklied over with self-distrust, and to shrink from trials with which his powers can really cope. The emotions themselves of self-satisfaction and abasement are of a unique sort, each as worthy to be classed as a primitive emotional species as are, for example, rage or pain. Each has its own peculiar physiognomical expression. In self-satisfaction, the extensor muscles are innervated, the eye is strong and glorious, the gait rolling and elastic, the nostrils dilated, and a peculiar smile plays upon the lips. This whole complex of symptoms is seen in an exquisite way in lunatic asylums, which always contain some patients who are literally mad with conceit, and whose fatuous expression and absurdly strutting or swaggering gait is in tragic contrast with their lack of any valuable personal quality. It is in these same castles of despair that we find the strongest examples of the opposite physiognomy, in good people who think they have committed the unpardonable sin, and are lost forever, who crouch and cringe and slink from notice, and are unable to speak aloud or look us in the eye. Like fear, and like anger in similar morbid conditions, these opposite feelings of self may be aroused with no adequate exciting cause. And in fact, we ourselves know how the barometer of our self-esteem and confidence rises and falls from one day to another through causes that seem to be visceral and organic rather than rational, and which certainly answer to no corresponding variations in the esteem in which we are held by our friends. C. Self-seeking and self-preservation come next. These words cover a large number of our fundamental instinctive impulses. We have those of bodily self-seeking, those of social self-seeking, and those of spiritual self-seeking. Bodily self-seeking. All the ordinary, useful reflex actions and movements of alimentation, and defense are acts of bodily self-preservation. Fear and anger prompt to acts that are useful in the same way. Whilst if by self-seeking we mean the providing for the future as distinguished from maintaining the present, we must class both anger and fear together with the hunting, the acquisitive, the home-constructing, and the tool-constructing instincts as impulses to self-seeking of the bodily kind. Really, however, these latter instincts with amativeness, parental fondness, curiosity, and emulation seek not only the development of the bodily me, but that of the material me in the widest possible sense of the word. Our social self-seeking, in turn, is carried on directly through our amativeness and friendliness, our desire to please and attract notice and admiration, our emulation and jealousy, our love of glory, influence, and power, and indirectly through whichever of the material self-seeking impulses proves serviceable as means to social ends. That the direct social self-seeking impulses are probably pure instincts is easily seen. The noteworthy thing about the desire to be recognized by others is that its strength has so little to do with the worth of the recognition computed in sensorial or rational terms. We are crazy to get a visiting list which shall be large, to be able to say when anyone is mentioned, "Oh, I know him well," and to be bowed to in the street by half the people we meet. Of course, distinguished friends and admiring recognition are the most desirable. Thackeray somewhere asked his readers to confess whether it would not give each of them an exquisite pleasure to be met walking down Pall Mall with a duke on either arm. But in default of dukes and envious salutations, almost anything will do for some of us, and there is a whole race of beings today whose passion is to keep their names in the newspapers, no matter under what heading. Arrivals and departures, personal paragraphs, interviews, gossip, even scandal will suit them if nothing better is to be had. Queteau, Garfield's assassin, is an example of the extremity to which this sort of craving for the notoriety of print may go in a pathological case. The newspapers bounded his mental horizon, and in the poor wretch's prayer on the scaffold, one of the most heartfelt expressions was, "The newspaper press of this land has a big bill to settle with thee, O Lord." Not only the people, but the places and things I know enlarge myself in a sort of metaphoric social way, so that it comes about that persons for whose opinion we care nothing are nevertheless persons whose notice we woo, and that many a man truly great, many a woman truly fastidious in most respects, will take a deal of trouble to dazzle some insignificant cad, whose whole personality they heartily despise. Under the head of spiritual self-seeking ought to be included every impulse towards psychic progress, whether intellectual, moral, or spiritual in the narrow sense of the term. It must be admitted, however, that much that commonly passes for the spiritual self-seeking in this narrow sense is only material and social self-seeking beyond the grave. In the Mohammedan desire for paradise and the Christian aspiration not to be damned in hell, the materiality of the goods sought is undisguised. In the more positive and refined view of heaven, many of its goods, the fellowship of the saints and of our dead ones, and the presence of God, are but social goods of the most exalted kind. It is only the search of the redeemed inward nature, the spotlessness from sin, whether here or hereafter, that can count as spiritual self-seeking, pure and undefiled. But this broad, external review of the facts of the life of the me will be incomplete without some account of the rivalry and conflict of the different me's. With most objects of desire, physical nature restricts our choice to but one of many represented goods, and even so it is here. I am often confronted by the necessity of standing by one of my empirical selves and relinquishing the rest. Not that I would not, if I could, be both handsome and fat and well-dressed and a great athlete and make $1 million a year, to be a wit, a bon vivant, and a lady killer, as well as a philosopher, a philanthropist, statesman, warrior, and African explorer, as well as a tone poet and saint. But the thing is simply impossible. The millionaire's work would run counter to the saint's. The bon vivant and the philanthropist would trip each other up. The philosopher and the lady killer could not well keep house in the same tenement of clay. Such different characters may conceivably at the outset of life be alike possible to a man, but to make any one of them actual, the rest must more or less be suppressed. So the seeker of his truest, strongest, deepest self must review his list carefully and pick out the one on which to stake his salvation. All other selves thereupon become unreal. But the fortunes of this self are real. Its failures are real failures. Its triumphs, real triumphs, carrying shame and gladness with them. This is as strong an example as there is of that selective industry of the mind on which I insisted some pages back. Our thought incessantly deciding among many things of a kind, which ones for it shall be realities, here chooses one of many possible selves or characters, and forthwith reckons it no shame to fail in any of those not adopted expressly as its own. So we have the paradox of a man shamed to death, because he is only the second pugilist or the second oarsman in the world. That he is able to beat the whole population of the globe minus one is nothing. He has pitted himself to beat that one, and as long as he doesn't do that, nothing else counts. He is to his own regard as if he were not, indeed he is not. Yonder puny fellow, however, whom everyone can beat, suffers no chagrin about it, for he has long ago abandoned the attempt to carry that line, as the merchants say, of self at all. With no attempt, there can be no failure. With no failure, no humiliation. So our self-feeling in this world depends entirely on what we back ourselves to be and do. It is determined by the ratio of our actualities to our supposed potentialities, a fraction of which our pretensions are the denominator, and the numerator our success. Thus, self-esteem equals success over or divided by pretensions. Such a fraction may be increased as well by diminishing the denominator as by increasing the numerator. To give up pretensions is as blessed a relief as to get them gratified. And where disappointment is incessant and the struggle unending, this is what men will always do. The history of evangelical theology, with its conviction of sin, its self-despair, and its abandonment of salvation by works, is the deepest of possible examples. But we meet others in every walk of life. There is the strangest lightness about the heart when one's nothingness in a particular line is once accepted in good faith. All is not bitterness in the lot of the lover sent away by the final, inexorable no. Many Bostonians, credo experto, and inhabitants of other cities too, I fear, would be happier women and men today if they could once for all abandon the notion of keeping up a musical self, and without shame let people hear them call a symphony a nuisance. How pleasant is the day when we give up striving to be young or slender. Thank God, we say, those illusions are gone. Everything added to the self is a burden as well as a pride. A certain man who lost every penny during our Civil War went and actually rolled in the dust, saying he had not felt so free and happy since he was born. Once more, then, our self-feeling is in our power. As Carlyle says, "Make thy claim of wages a zero, then hast thou the world under thy feet." Well did the wisest of our time write, "It is only with renunciation that life, properly speaking, can be said to begin." Neither threats nor pleadings can move a man unless they touch some one of his potential or actual selves. Only thus can we, as a rule, get purchase on another's will. The first care of diplomatists and monarchs and all who wish to rule or influence is, accordingly, to find out their victim's strongest principle of self-regard, so as to make that the fulcrum of all appeals. But
But if a man has given up those things which are subject to foreign fate, and ceased to regard them as parts of himself at all, we are well nigh powerless over him. The Stoic receipt for contentment was to dispossess yourself in advance of all that was out of your own power. Then fortune's shocks might rain down unfelt. Epictetus exhorts us, by thus narrowing and at the same time solidifying ourself to make it invulnerable. Quote, I must die. Well, but must I die groaning too? I will speak what appears to be right, and if the despot says, then I will put you to death, I will reply, when did I ever tell you that I was immortal? You will do your part, and I mine. It is yours to kill and mine to die intrepid, yours to banish, mine to depart untroubled. How do we act in a voyage? We choose the pilot, the sailors, the hour. Afterwards comes a storm. What have I to care for? My part is performed. This matter belongs to the pilot. But the ship is sinking. What then have I to do? That which alone I can do. Submit to being drowned without fear, without clamor or accusing of God, but as one who knows that what is born must likewise die. End quote. This Stoic fashion, though efficacious and heroic enough in its place and time, is, it must be confessed, only possible as a habitual mood of the soul to narrow and unsympathetic characters. It proceeds altogether by exclusion. If I am a Stoic, the goods I cannot appropriate cease to be my goods, and the temptation lies very near to deny that they are goods at all. We find this mode of protecting the self by exclusion and denial very common among people who are in other respects not Stoics. All narrow people entrench their me, they retract it from the region of what they cannot securely possess. People who don't resemble them or who treat them with indifference, people over whom they gain no influence, are people on whose existence, however meritorious it may intrinsically be, they look with chill negation, as if, and not with positive hate. Who will not be mine, I will exclude from existence altogether. That is, as far as I can make it so, such people shall be as if they were not. Thus may a certain absoluteness and definiteness in the outline of my me console me for the smallness of its content. Sympathetic people, on the contrary, proceed by the entirely opposite way of expansion and inclusion. The outline of their self often gets uncertain enough, but for this the spread of its content more than atones. Nil humani a me alienum. Let them despise this little person of mine and treat me like a dog. I shall not negate them so long as I have a soul in my body. They are realities as much as I am. What positive good is in them shall be mine too, etc., etc. The magnanimity of these expansive natures is often touching indeed. Such persons can feel a sort of delicate rapture in thinking that, however sick, ill-favored, mean-conditioned, and generally forsaken they may be, they yet are integral parts of the whole of this brave world, have a fellow's share in the strength of the dray horses, the happiness of the young people, the wisdom of the wise ones, and are not altogether without part or lot in the good fortunes of the Vanderbilts and the Hohenzollerns themselves. Thus, either by negating or by embracing, the ego may seem to establish itself in reality. He who, with Marcus Aurelius, can truly say, O universe, I wish all that thou wishest, has a self from which every trace of negativeness and obstructiveness has been removed. No wind can blow except to fill its sails. The hierarchy of me's. A tolerably unanimous opinion ranges the different selves of which a man may be seized and possessed, and the consequent different orders of his self-regard, in a hierarchical scale, with the bodily me at the bottom, the spiritual me at the top, and the extracorporeal material selves and the various social selves between. Our merely natural self-seeking would lead us to aggrandize all these selves. We give up deliberately only those among them which we find we cannot keep. Our unselfishness is thus apt to be a virtue of necessity, and it is not without all show of reason that cynics quote the fable of the fox and the grapes in describing our progress therein. But this is the moral education of the race, and if we agree in the result that on the whole the selves we can keep are the intrinsically best, we need not complain of being led to the knowledge of their superior worth in such a tortuous way. Of course, this is not the only way in which we learn to subordinate our lower selves to our higher. A direct ethical judgment unquestionably also plays its part. And last, not least, we apply to our own persons judgments originally called forth by the act of others. It is one of the strangest laws of our nature that many things which we are well satisfied with in ourselves disgust us when seen in others. With another man's bodily hoggishness, hardly anyone has any sympathy, almost as little with his cupidity, his social vanity and eagerness, his jealousy, his despotism, and his pride. Left absolutely to myself, I should probably allow all these spontaneous tendencies to luxuriate in me unchecked, and it would be long before I formed a distinct notion of the order of their subordination. But having constantly to pass judgment on my associates, I come ere long to see, as Herr Horowitz says, my own lusts in the mirror of the lusts of others, and to think about them in a very different way from that in which I simply feel. Of course, the moral generalities which from childhood have been instilled into me accelerate enormously the advent of this reflective judgment on myself. So it comes to pass that as aforesaid, men have arranged the various selves which they may seek in a hierarchical scale according to their worth. A certain amount of bodily selfishness is required as a basis for all the other selves. But too much sensuality is despised, or at best condoned on account of the other qualities of the individual. The wider material selves are regarded as higher than the immediate body. He is esteemed a poor creature who is unable to forego a little meat and drink and warmth and sleep for the sake of getting on in the world. The social self as a whole, again, ranks higher than the material self as a whole. We must care more for our honor, our friends, our human ties than for a sound skin or wealth. And the spiritual self is so supremely precious that, rather than lose it, a man ought to be willing to give up friends and good fame and property and life itself. In each kind of me, material, social, and spiritual, men distinguish between the immediate and actual, and the remote and potential, between the narrower and the wider view, to the detriment of the former and the advantage of the latter. One must forego a present bodily enjoyment for the sake of one's general health, and one must abandon the dollar in the hand for the sake of the $100 to come. One must make an enemy of his present interlocutor if thereby one makes friends of a more valued circle. One must go without learning and grace and wit, the better to compass one's soul's salvation. Of all these wider, more potential selves, the potential social me is the most interesting, by reason of certain apparent paradoxes to which it leads in conduct, and by reason of its connection with our moral and religious life. When, for motives of honor and conscience, I brave the condemnation of my own family, club, and set, when, as a Protestant, I turn Catholic, as a Catholic, a freethinker, as a regular practitioner, a homeopath, or what not, I am always inwardly strengthened in my course, and steeled against the loss of my actual social self by the thought of other and better possible social judges than those whose verdict goes against me now. The ideal social self, which I thus seek in appealing to their decision, may be very remote. It may be represented as barely possible. I may not hope for its realization during my lifetime. I may even expect the future generations, which would approve me if they knew me, to know nothing about me when I am dead and gone. Yet still the emotion that beckons me on is indubitably the pursuit of an ideal social self, of a self that is at least worthy of approving recognition by the highest possible judging companion, if such companion there be. This self is the true, the intimate, the ultimate, the permanent me which I seek. This judge is God, the absolute mind, the great companion. We hear in these days of scientific enlightenment a great deal of discussion about the efficacy of prayer, and many reasons are given us why we should not pray, whilst others are given as why we should. But in all this, very little is said of the reason why we do pray, which is simply that we cannot help praying. It seems probable that, in spite of all that science may do to the contrary, men will continue to pray to the end of time, unless their mental nature changes in a manner which nothing we know should lead us to expect. The impulse to pray is a necessary consequence of the fact that whilst the innermost of the empirical selves of a man is a self of the social sort, it yet can find its only adequate socius in an ideal world. All progress in the social self is the substitution of higher tribunals for lower. This ideal tribunal is the highest, and most men, either continually or occasionally, carry a reference to it in their breast. The humblest outcast on this earth can feel himself to be real and valid by means of this higher recognition. And on the other hand, for most of us, a world with no such inner refuge when the outer social self failed and dropped from us would be the abyss of horror. I say for most of us because it is probable that individuals differ a good deal in the degree in which they are haunted by this sense of an ideal spectator. It is a much more essential part of the consciousness of some men than of others. Those who have the most of it are possibly the most religious men, but I am sure that even those who say they are altogether without it deceive themselves, and really have it in some degree. Only a non-gregarious animal could be completely without it. Probably no one can make sacrifices for right without to some degree personifying the principle of right for which the sacrifice is made, and expecting thanks from it. Complete social unselfishness, in other words, can hardly exist. Complete social suicide hardly occur to a man's mind. Even such texts as Job's, "Though he slay me, yet will I trust him," or Marcus Aurelius's, "If gods hate me and my children, there is a reason for it," can least of all be cited to prove the contrary. For beyond all doubt, Job reveled in the thought of Jehovah's recognition of the worship after the slaying should have been done, and the Roman emperor felt sure the absolute reason would not be all indifferent to his acquiescence in the god's dislike. The old test of piety, "Are you willing to be damned for the glory of God?" was probably never answered in the affirmative except by those who felt sure in their heart of hearts that God would credit them with their willingness, and set more store by them thus than if in his unfathomable scheme he had not damned them at all. Teleological uses of self-interest. On zoological principles, it is easy to see why we have been endowed with impulses of self-seeking and with emotions of self-satisfaction and the reverse. Unless our consciousness were something more than cognitive, unless it experienced a partiality for certain of the objects which in succession occupy its ken, it could not long maintain itself in existence. For, by an inscrutable necessity, each human mind's appearance on this earth is conditioned upon the integrity of the body with which it belongs, upon the treatment which that body gets from others, and upon the spiritual dispositions which use it as their tool, and lead it either towards longevity or to destruction. Its own body, then, first of all, its friends next, and finally its spiritual dispositions must be the supremely interesting objects for each human mind. Each mind, to begin with, must have a certain minimum of selfishness in the shape of instincts of bodily self-seeking in order to exist. This minimum must be there as a basis for all farther conscious acts, whether of self-negation or of a selfishness more subtle still. All minds have come by the way of the survival of the fittest, if by no directer path, to take an intense interest in the bodies to which they are yoked, altogether apart from any interest in the pure ego which they also possess, and similarly with the images of their person in the minds of others. I should not be extant now, had I not become sensitive to looks of approval or disapproval on the faces among which my life is cast. Looks of contempt, cast on other persons, need affect me in no such peculiar way. My spiritual powers, again, must interest me more than those of other people, and for the same reason. I should not be here at all unless I had cultivated them and kept them from decay. And the same law which made me once care for them makes me care for them still. All these three things form the natural me, but all these things are objects, properly so called, to the thought which at any time may be doing the thinking. And if the zoological and evolutionary point of view is the true one, there is no reason why one object might not arouse passion and interest as primitively and instinctively as any other. The phenomenon of passion is in origin and essence the same, whatever be the target upon which it is discharged. And what the target actually happens to be is solely a question of fact. I might conceivably be as much fascinated, and as primitively so, by the care of my neighbor's body as by the care of my own. I am thus fascinated by the care of my child's body. The only check to such exuberant, non-egoistic interests is natural selection, which would weed out such as were very harmful to the individual or to his tribe. Many such interests, however, remain unweeded out. The interests in the opposite sex, for example, which seems in mankind stronger than is called for by its utilitarian need. And alongside of them remain interests like that in alcoholic intoxication or in musical sounds which, for aught we can see, are without any utility whatever. The sympathetic instincts and the egoistic ones are thus coordinate. They arise, so far as we can tell, on the same psychological level. The only difference between them is that the instincts called egoistic form much the larger mass.
B. The self as knower. The I, or pure ego, is a very much more difficult subject of inquiry than the me. It is that which at any given moment is conscious, whereas the me is only one of the things which it is conscious of. In other words, it is the thinker, and the question immediately comes up, what is the thinker? It is the passing state of consciousness. Is it the passing state of consciousness itself, or is it something deeper and less mutable? Yet each of us spontaneously considers that by I, he means something always the same. This has led most philosophers to postulate behind the passing state of consciousness a permanent substance or agent whose modification or act it is. This agent is the thinker. The state is only its instrument or means. Soul, transcendental ego, spirit are so many names for this more permanent sort of thinker. Not discriminating them just yet, let us proceed to define our idea of the passing state of consciousness more clearly. The unity of the passing thought. Already, in speaking of sensations from the point of view of Fechner's idea of measuring them, we saw that there was no ground for calling them compounds. But what is true of sensations cognizing simple qualities is also true of thoughts, with complex objects composed of many parts. This proposition, unfortunately, runs counter to a widespread prejudice, and will have to be defended at some length. Common sense, and psychologists of almost every school,
have agreed that whenever an object of thought contains many elements, the thought itself must be made up of just as many ideas, one idea for each element, all fused together in appearance, but really separate. There can be no difficulty in admitting that association does form the ideas of an indefinite number of individuals into one complex idea, says James Mill, because it is an acknowledged fact. Mill continues, have we not the idea of an army? Is it not that precisely the ideas of an indefinite number of men formed into one idea? Similar quotations might be multiplied, and the reader's own first impressions probably would rally to their support. Suppose, for example, he thinks that the pack of cards is on the table. If he begins to reflect, he is as likely as not to say, well, isn't that a thought of the pack of cards? Isn't it of the cards as included in the pack? Isn't it of the table, and of the legs of the table as well? Hasn't my thought then all these parts, one part for the pack and another for the table, and within the pack part, a part for each card, as within the table part, a part for each leg? And isn't each of these parts an idea? And can thought then be anything but an assemblage or pack of ideas, each answering to some element of what it knows? Plausible as such considerations may seem, it is astonishing how little force they have. In assuming a pack of ideas, each cognizant of some one element of the fact one has assumed, nothing has been assumed which knows the whole fact at once. The idea which, on the hypothesis of the pack of ideas, knows, for example, the ace of spades must be ignorant of the leg of the table, since to account for that knowledge another special idea is by the same hypothesis invoked, and so on with the rest of the ideas, all equally ignorant of each other's objects. And yet, in the actual living human mind, what knows the cards also knows the table, its legs, etc., for all these things are known in relation to each other and at once. Our notion of the abstract number 8, or 4, or 2, is as truly one feeling of the mind as our notion of simple unity. Our idea of a couple is not a couple of ideas. But, the reader may say, is not the taste of lemonade composed of that of lemon plus that of sugar? No, I reply. This is taking the combining of objects for that of feelings. The physical lemonade contains both the lemon and the sugar, but its taste does not contain their tastes. For if there are any two things which are certainly not present in the taste of lemonade, those are the pure lemon sour on the one hand and the pure sugar sweet on the other. These tastes are absent utterly. A taste somewhat like both of them is there, but that is a distinct state of mind altogether. Distinct mental states cannot fuse. But not only is the notion that our ideas are combinations of smaller ideas improbable, it is logically unintelligible. It leaves out the essential features of all the combinations which we actually know. All the combinations which we actually know are effects, wrought by the units said to be combined upon some entity other than themselves. Without this feature of a medium or vehicle, the notion of combination has no sense. In other words, no possible number of entities, call them as you like, whether forces, material particles, or mental elements, no possible number of entities can sum themselves together. Each remains, in the sum, what it always was, and the sum itself exists only for a bystander who happens to overlook the units and to apprehend the sum as such. Or else it exists in the shape of some other effect on an entity external to the sum itself. When H2 and O are said to combine into water, and thenceforward to exhibit new properties, the water is just the old atoms in the new position, H, O, H. The new properties are just their combined effects, when in this position upon external media, such as our sense organs, and the various reagents on which water may exert its properties and be known. Just so, The strength of many men may combine when they pull upon one rope, of many muscular fibers when they pull upon one tendon. In the parallelogram of forces, the forces do not combine themselves into the diagonal resultant. A body is needed on which they may impinge to exhibit their resultant effect. No more do musical sounds combine per se into concords or discords. Concord and discord are names for their combined effects on that external medium, the ear. Where the elemental units are supposed to be feelings, the case is no wise altered. Take 100 of them, shuffle them, and pack them as close together as you can, whatever that may mean. Still, each remains the same feeling it always was, shut in its own skin, windowless, ignorant of what the other feelings are and mean. There would be a 101st feeling there if, when a group or series of such feelings were set up, a consciousness belonging to the group as such should emerge. And this 101st feeling would be a total new fact. The 100 original feelings might, by a curious physical law, be a signal for its creation when they come together. We often have to learn things separately before we know them as a sum, but they would have no substantial identity with the new feeling, nor it with them, and one could never deduce the one from the others, or, in any intelligible sense, say that they evolved it out of themselves. Take a sentence of a dozen words, and take 12 men, and tell to each one word. Then stand the men in a row or jam them in a bunch, and let each think of his word as intently as he will. Nowhere will there be a consciousness of the whole sentence. We talk, it is true, of the spirit of the age and the sentiment of the people, and in various ways we hypostatize public opinion. But we know this to be symbolic speech, and never dream that the spirit, opinion, or sentiment constitutes a consciousness other than, and additional to, that of the several individuals whom the words age, people, or public denote. The private minds do not agglomerate into a higher compound mind. This has always been the invincible contention of the spiritualists against the associationists in psychology. The associationists say that mind is constituted by a multiplicity of distinct ideas associated into a unity. There is, they say, an idea of A and also an idea of B. Therefore, they say, there is an idea of A plus B, or of A and B together, which is like saying that the mathematical square of A plus that of B is equal to the square of A plus B, a palpable untruth. Idea of A plus idea of B is not identical with idea of A plus B. It is one. They are two. In it, what knows A also knows B. In them, what knows A is expressly posited as not knowing B, etc. In short, the two separate ideas can never by any logic be made to figure as one idea. If one idea, of A plus B, for example, come as a matter of fact after the two separate ideas of A and of B, then we must hold it to be as direct a product of the latter conditions as the two separate ideas were of the earlier conditions. The simplest thing, therefore, if we are to assume the existence of a stream of consciousness at all, would be to suppose that things that are known together are known in single pulses of that stream. The things may be many, and may occasion many currents in the brain, but the psychic phenomenon correlative to these many currents is one integral state, transitive or substantive, to which the many things appear. The soul as a combining medium. The spiritualists in philosophy have been prompt to see that things which are known together are known by one something. But that something, they say, is no mere passing thought, but a simple and permanent spiritual being on which many ideas combine their effects. It makes no difference in this connection whether this being be called soul, ego, or spirit. In either case, its chief function is that of a combining medium. This is a different vehicle of knowledge from that in which we just said that the mystery of knowing things together might be most simply lodged. Which is the real knower, this permanent being, or our passing state? If we had other grounds not yet considered for admitting the soul into our psychology, then
Getting there on those grounds, she might turn out to be the knower too. But if there be no other grounds for admitting the soul, we had better cling to our passing states as the exclusive agents of knowledge. For we have to assume their existence anyhow in psychology, and the knowing of many things together is just as well accounted for when we call it one of their functions as when we call it a reaction of the soul. Explained it is not by either conception, and has to figure in psychology as a datum that is ultimate. But there are other alleged grounds for admitting the soul into psychology, and the chief of them is the sense of personal identity. It was stated that the thoughts which we actually know to exist do not fly about loose, but seem each to belong to some one thinker and not to another. Each thought, out of a multitude of other thoughts of which it may think, is able to distinguish those which belong to it from those which do not. The former have a warmth and intimacy about them of which the latter are completely devoid, and the result is a me of yesterday, judged to be in some peculiarly subtle sense the same with the I who now make the judgment. As a mere subjective phenomenon, the judgment presents no special mystery. It belongs to the great class of judgments of sameness, and there is nothing more remarkable in making a judgment of sameness in the first person than in the second or the third. The intellectual operations seem essentially alike. Whether I say, I am the same as I was, or whether I say, the pen is the same as it was yesterday, it is as easy to think this as to think the opposite, and say, neither of us is the same. The only question which we have to consider is whether it be a right judgment. Is the sameness predicated really there? Sameness in the self as known. If in the sentence, I am the same that I was yesterday, we take the I broadly, it is evident that in many ways I am not the same. As a concrete me, I am somewhat different from what I was. Then hungry, now full. Then walking, now at rest. Then poorer, now richer. Then younger, now older, etc. And yet, in other ways, I am the same, and we may call these the essential ways. My name and profession and relations to the world are identical. My face, my faculties, and store of memories are practically indistinguishable now and then. Moreover, the me of now and the me of then are continuous. The alterations were gradual, and never affected the whole of me at once. So far, then, my personal identity is just like the sameness predicated of any other aggregate thing. It is a conclusion grounded either on the resemblance in essential respects or on the continuity of the phenomena compared. And it must not be taken to mean more than these grounds warrant, or treated as a sort of metaphysical or absolute unity in which all differences are overwhelmed. The past and present selves compared are the same just so far as they are the same and no farther. They are the same in kind, but this generic sameness coexists with generic differences just as real. And if from the one point of view I am one self, from another I am quite as truly many. Similarly, of the attribute of continuity, it gives to the self the unity of mere connectedness, or unbrokenness, a perfectly definite phenomenal thing, but it gives not a jot or tittle more. Not a jot or tittle more. Sameness in the self as knower. But all this is said only of the me, or self as known. In the judgment, I am the same, the I was taken broadly as the concrete person. Suppose, however, that we take it narrowly as the thinker, as that to which all the concrete determinations of the me belong and are known. Does there not then appear an absolute identity at different times? That something which at every moment goes out and knowingly appropriates the me of the past and discards the non-me as foreign, is it not a permanent abiding principle of spiritual activity identical with itself wherever found? That it is such a principle is the reigning doctrine both of philosophy and common sense, and yet reflection finds it difficult to justify the idea. If there were no passing states of consciousness, then indeed we might suppose an abiding principle,
absolutely one with itself, to be the ceaseless thinker in each one of us. But if the states of consciousness be accorded as realities, no such substantial identity in the thinker need be supposed. Yesterday's and today's states of consciousness have no substantial identity, for when one is here, the other is irrevocably dead and gone. But they have a functional identity, for both know the same objects, and so far as the bygone me is one of those objects, they react upon it in an identical way, greeting it and calling it mine, and opposing it to all the other things they know. This functional identity seems really the only sort of identity in the thinker which the facts require us to suppose. Successive thinkers, numerically distinct, but all aware of the same past in the same way, form an adequate vehicle for all the experience of personal unity and sameness which we actually have. And just such a train of successive thinkers is the stream of mental states, each with its complex object cognized and emotional and selective reaction thereupon, which psychology treated as a natural science has to assume. The logical conclusion seems then to be that the states of consciousness are all that psychology needs to do her work with. Metaphysics or theology may prove the soul to exist, but for psychology the hypothesis of such a substantial principle of unity is superfluous. How the I appropriates the me. But why should each successive mental state appropriate the same past me? I spoke a while ago of my own past experiences appearing to me with a warmth and intimacy which the experiences thought of by me as having occurred to other people lack. This leads us to the answer sought. My present me is felt with warmth and intimacy. The heavy warm mass of my body is there, and the nucleus of the spiritual me, the sense of intimate activity, is there. We cannot realize our present self without simultaneously feeling one or other of these two things. Any other object of thought which brings these two things with it into consciousness will be thought with a warmth and an intimacy like those which cling to the present me. Any distant object which fulfills this condition will be thought with such warmth and intimacy. But which distant objects do fulfill the condition when represented? Obviously those, and only those, which fulfilled it when they were alive. Them we shall still represent with the animal warmth upon them. To them may possibly still cling the flavor of the inner activity taken in the act. And by a natural consequence, we shall assimilate them to each other and to the warm and intimate self we now feel within us as we think, and separate them as a collection from whatever objects have not this mark, much as out of a herd of cattle let loose for the winter on some wide western prairie, the owner picks out and sorts together, when the roundup comes in the spring, all the beasts on which he finds his own particular brand. Well, just such objects are the past experiences which I now call mine. Other men's experiences, no matter how much I may know about them, never bear this vivid, this peculiar brand. This is why Peter, awakening in the same bed with Paul, and recalling what both had in mind before they went to sleep, re-identifies and appropriates the warm ideas as his, and is never tempted to confuse them with those cold and pale-appearing ones which he ascribes to Paul. All well might be confound in Paul's body. As well might he confound Paul's body, which he only sees, with his own body, which he sees but also feels. Each of us, when he awakens, says, "Here's the same old me again," just as he says, "Here's the same old bed, the same old room, the same old world." And similarly in our waking hours, though each pulse of consciousness dies away and is replaced by another, yet that other among the things it knows its own predecessor, and finding it warm in the way we have described, greets it, saying, "Thou art mine, and part of the same self with me." Each later thought, knowing and including thus the thoughts that went before, is the final receptacle, and appropriating them is the final owner of all that they contain and own. As Kant says, it is as if elastic balls were to have not only motion but knowledge of it, and a first ball were to transmit both its motion and its consciousness to a second, which took both up into its consciousness and passed them to a third, until the last ball held all that the other balls had held and realized it as its own. It is this trick which the nascent thought has of immediately taking up the expiring thought and adopting it, which leads to the appropriation of most of the remoter constituents of the self. Who owns the last self owns the self before the last, for what possesses the possessor possesses the possessed. It is impossible to discover any verifiable features in personal identity which this sketch does not contain, impossible to imagine how any transcendent principle of unity, were such a principle there, could shape matters to any other result, or be known by any other fruit, than just this production of a stream of consciousness, each successive part of which should know, and knowing, hug to itself and adopt all those that went before, thus standing as the representative of an entire past stream with which it is in no wise to be identified.